Welcome to the Cities at Tufts virtual colloquium. I'm Professor Julian Adgerman, and together with my research assistants Ainsley Judge and Max Sebar and our partners Shareable and the Bar Foundation, we organise Cities at Tufts as a cross-disciplinary academic initiative which recognises Tufts University's a leader in urban studies, urban planning and sustainability issues. We'd like to acknowledge that Tufts University's Medford campus is located on colonised Wampanoag and Massachusetts traditional territory. Today, we're delighted to host Dr. Benjamin K. Sovacool. He's Professor of Earth and Environment at Boston University. He's also the founding director of the Institute for Global Sustainability at BU. He's also Professor of Energy Policy at the Bennett Institute for Innovation and Policy Acceleration at the University of Sussex Business School in the UK. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society for the Arts, Manufactures and Commerces. He's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and a Fellow of the Academy of Europe. He was formerly Director of the Sussex Energy Group at the Science Policy Research Unit of the University of Sussex Business School, again in the UK. He was also Director of the Centre for Energy Technology and the University Distinguished Professor of Business and Social Sciences at Aarhus University in Denmark. Ben's talk today is Accelerating Energy and Low Carbon Transitions as an Interdisciplinary Social Science Challenge. Not quite the title that he gave us, but very much allied. I always say, Ben, a Zoom-tastic welcome to Cities at Tufts, but Ben isn't actually here. He's in Seoul, South Korea, and so he's supplied us with a video. So you'll get to hear him talk, but we won't obviously have any time for questions because he's not here. He has, though, very generously invited you, if you have questions, to email him saying that you were at his Cities at Tufts talk, and then he will answer questions. So, Benjamin, a Zoom-tastic welcome to Cities at Tufts.
So today's topic is kind of dear to my heart, and it is going to kind of both showcase the value of interdisciplinary work, but also it's going to cut across kind of conceptual frontiers, methodological frontiers, and thematic frontiers or empirical frontiers and how we do research. So it is kind of a really broad presentation, and I'm even going to start by mentioning Aristotle, who wrote thousands of years ago that those who control the definition control the debate. And that's very important whenever we start to talk about energy transitions, is how we define it. You can see here, we found some prominent scholars like Vaclav Smil or Roger Fouquet, Richard Hirsch and Christopher Jones, who are historians. And of course, 5 scholars give you 5 different definitions for what an energy transition is. The classic notion that's still used by groups like the International Energy Agency or DESNZ is kind of changes in fuel supply. So security of supply, SOS, has changed from coal to nuclear, from oil to renewables, or even historically from, say, woody biomass to things like crude oil or electricity. But a lot of these energy transitions are more than changes in supply. You can also change the energy technologies or devices that use energy services. Sometimes they're called prime movers, like internal combustion engines or gas turbines. Sometimes they're called end-use devices like microwaves or refrigerators or mobile phones or air conditioners or heat pumps. And all of these can also accelerate a transition, has nothing to do with supply and everything to do with demand. A third one is less intuitive, but it can also talk about the regulatory system we use, the institutions and the governance of energy systems or electricity systems. The United States is a quirky case because they have a mix of restructured and privatized electricity markets and monopoly electricity markets, right? They've kind of stalled halfway with electric utility restructuring. And as you all know, Margaret Thatcher ushered in a whole wave of liberalization of energy sectors, oil and gas and so forth, that's been exported around the world by groups like the World Bank. I have Cuba here in parentheses because that's another great example. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1990 had a massive shock to the Cuban energy system that had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with changes of sanctions and institutions and subsidies. Lastly, if you get away from energy scholars, you also have other disciplines, especially psychology, innovation studies, that talk about diffusion. And here, a transition is actually the time it takes, a delta, for a new innovation to trickle down and be adopted. The most famous theory here is Everett Rogers' diffusion of innovation. So innovations kind of go out among early adopters, laggards, and so forth. And then you can complicate any of these four scales of demand, of supply, of institutions, and behavior at a variety of scales, from the scale of the individual to the scale of the household, the neighborhood, the city, the region, the devolved nation, Wales, Scotland, the region, the European Union or European Commission or geographic notion of Europe, all the way up to the global scale. In our work, both at Sussex and Boston University, we kind of take all of the above. We've looked at all sorts of transitions across all these different dimensions, across all these different scales. And this can lead to very different conceptualizations of what transitions are. Arnulf Grubler and Charlie Wilson. Charlie's actually here in the UK. He's currently at Oxford, used to be at UEA. They had a really nice temporal and spatial theory of transitions. They never named it. I wish they would have named it something. But you can see the temporal dynamics on the left. Energy transition begins with a new technology that you experiment with and learn, and then you scale up to units, then you scale up to industries, then you create standards, and then you eventually create market saturation. And then on the right, they talk about how this happens spatially, not just temporally. It goes from the core, say Watt's steam engine, and then emerges all the way to the rim. At that time, it would have been Germany, France, and the Netherlands, and then eventually it reaches the periphery. And you can see that some of these time periods are very long, even in Europe, for that to happen. In my own PhD, my lovely mentor, Richard Hirsch, had me use large technical systems, which is another theory, going back to Thomas Park Hughes at MIT, who wrote a book in 1983 called Networks of Power, which was about how electricity systems emerged from their invention with Thomas Edison and arguably Tesla, all the way to the late 30s, where electricity was ubiquitous. And for Hughes, he used this lovely term, the socio-technical system. For electricity to become successfully transitioned, it had to align not just technology and artifacts, but economic regulations and standards and incentives, educational communities about how electricity systems work, legal and administrative ones, and as well as even political and cultural ones. And these align to create what he called momentum, which today we might call path dependence or lock-in. And he also had these phases. So there's a temporal element, just like Grubler and Wilson, to how electricity systems evolved from invention to technology transfer to growth. Momentum is there. And then style, when systems start to differentiate themselves. So say the Dutch energy system looks very different than the Danish energy system, which looks very different than the British energy system, and so forth. Hughes ended his theorizing in the 1930s with style. And we were interested, Catherine and Marie Blanche, with kind of what happens after style. And so we kind of picked up from Hughes and went even further in saying that even after they achieve style, systems can become reconfigured, whether they're bought out, whether they face crises. They can enter periods of contestation where they can drift or even stagnate and decline. And you can also see now the arrows start to move backwards in some of these areas to emphasize that systems can go back and forth. They can start to stagnate and decline, like electric trolleys, and then come back as we start to get rid of cars. And so I also like that these elements become coevolutionary and bidirectional, especially after reconfiguration. And we did apply this to a variety of different energy systems. You can see here shale gas, electricity grids. I think we have railways and streetcars, but also other socio-technical systems as well. Telecommunications, sewer systems, marine transport, even things like gas pipelines. Just as an aside, before I move on, I really did want to emphasize the interdisciplinarity of transitions as a kind of space. And I did this wonderful article with David, who's a sociologist of scientific knowledge, where we literally created an article ordering theories, and that's ordering in three ways. Ordering in terms of what are the constituent pieces of a theory, what are their concepts, and how are they ordered together. Secondly, how are they ordered in terms of their assumptions? Are they positivist, post-positivist, constructivist, and so forth? And lastly, ordering in terms of how many theories might there be in this space of transitions, or the fancy term socio-technical change, so that scholars and students can order as if they're ordering from a menu. So that's the kind of triple meaning of the word ordering theories. And it's amazing. We interviewed a little more than 30 scholars, and they gave us 96 different theories. And you can see here how few of those theories come from technology or economics. Many of them actually are behavioral science, that's that blue color, or innovation studies, that's that gray color, or the very constructivist science and technology studies, STS, which is right there in that orange color. 96 theories is a lot. We have a whole appendix that is actually the menu in the paper where you can see all 96 theories in order of discipline. You can see the name of the theory, the key authors, and then a quick 1 or 2 sentence explanation of how they actually relate to transitions or this notion of socio-technical diffusion, acceptance, and change. It was a bit arbitrary, but we also wanted to look at which of these 96 theories were most popular among respondents, or if you want a more pejorative term, which ones were best at explaining transitions. And we took 10% as a cutoff. So if a theory was mentioned in 10% of the interviews, then we actually classified it as more frequently mentioned. And that at least gets us a much shorter list of 14 theories rather than 96. And here they are in order. And it's fascinating that the first one is socio-technical transitions or the multi-level perspective. That's Frank Giels and Johann Schott and Rene Kemp. And the second one is social practice theory, which is the work of Harriet Bulkley and Elizabeth Shove and others talking about comfort and cleanliness and convenience and evolving practices by which we put energy use to. I'll present you more on socio-technical transitions later in the talk, but you can also see a whole variety of other very interdisciplinary theories. My lovely LTS is there. The social construction of technology is kind of history. The sociology of expectations is really about imaginations and futures and anticipation. Justice theory is really about ethics. And then finally, you taught at the Bow is about management science and the kind of hedonic preferences and willingness to adopt that consumer classes have for new technologies. So moving away from this conceptual quagmire or minefield, let's switch to talk more about the timing and the empirics of transitions, separate from how we theorize them. What is some evidence to how fast or slow they exist? Now, I already showed you this lovely diagram from Grubler and Wilson, which again, now I'll recast. Look how long these transitions take, even in a geographically constrained space that is Europe. 96 years from to Sweden was the fastest diffusion of things like steam power and coal. And even though it has ubiquitous benefits to solid fuels, oil and electricity still took 47 years to phase into Portugal in the 60s. And I will confess to you right now, 47 years is still older than me. So it took longer than my life by a year for Portugal to adopt these systems. And you can see many of the adoption rates are closer to 70 years and definitely greater than half a century. So these temporal dynamics have convinced Václav Smil, who's a very prominent geographer, to argue, this is his words, energy transitions have been and will continue to be inherently prolonged affairs, especially in places where there's lots of consumption and massive infrastructure. And look at what he says next. It is impossible to accelerate their progress, even if we resort to highly effective interventions like command and control regulations or carbon taxes. There was a kind of another piece he wrote, I think in IEEE, where he talked about energy transitions as an intergenerational challenge of engineers, that it will never happen within a single generation. It will take 2 or 3 generations of engineering and advances for us to actually have transitions. And there is some data to support Smil. This is also from Smil. This shows you the great 3 energy transitions: coal, oil, and gas. We are talking now at the global scale, and it's the data, the same data plotted twice. So at the top is the timeline, at the bottom is just the years to make it a little easier to see. So the transition to coal globally, just to reach 5% of total primary energy supply, was 85 years. Oil was more than 40 years, gas was more than 50 years, nuclear isn't even close. And when you add up the amount to reach 25%, nuclear hasn't made it yet, neither has solar or wind or hydro. Remember, this is not global electricity supply. This is total primary energy supply. So electricity is just a subset because we're also talking about agriculture and transport and mobility and buildings and land use and all of that. You can also look at the diffusion literature, and here we have Arnolf and Charlie teaming up with the innovation scholar Gregory Nemeth, where they've also looked at both the formative phases and the diffusion phases. So these are two separate phases. The phases on the left are basically RD&D. How long did researchers experiment and tweak and work in a lab just to get the technology to commercialization? And of course, they can keep tweaking it even after it's commercialized. So the formative phase can keep going. And on the right is once it's been commercialized or is commercially available, how long does it take to diffuse? And you can look at all of those different phases that are belong more than a century. And even things that are supposed to diffuse very fast, like e-bikes and mobile phones, still take at least a decade to go. And notice they're going back to this language of the core, the rim, and the periphery, where, of course, going to the periphery also takes incredibly long amounts of time. Unfortunately for us, Grubler, Wilson, and Nemeth are also talking about how this is just for individual units. When you go up beyond individual technologies to systems of systems, electricity grids, sociotechnical gas regimes, those are even harder to transition, especially things that require multiple components together. Another clever way of looking at transitions isn't how long it takes to phase something in, but how long it takes to phase something out. Turnheim and Hills call this regime destabilization, and I love the title. It's the flip side of an energy transition. And here we can go much closer to home. Their case study is British coal. And even though they ended it in 1997, actually we still had a British coal transition going up till about 2 years ago. And you can see here, the phase out of coal still takes more than a century. And you can also see all of those punctuated equilibria. It's like a roller coaster, right? Where you have all these competing pressures on the coal system. It rises, it falls, it rises, it falls, it rises, it falls. And even in the 2000s, when we thought coal, right, had all this pressure because of pollution, because of prices, because of strikes and labor to phase it out because we wanted to support nuclear, Hinkley C, and gas, it still went another 20 years. So obviously it takes a very long time to phase in, and it takes a very long time to phase out. But within this corpus of literature, there are some oddities. For instance, a big one, what is the right number by which you say a transition occurs? Smill was 5% and 25%. I think Grubler and Wilson is 50%. There are others who say 10%. These are also nice round numbers. Why isn't it 8.85% or something? So it is a kind of really debatable what is the number. Also, there's this notion of even if you look at systems rather than individual technologies, they still co-evolve with other systems. Systems can mimic each other or can actually have very strong coupling. A really good example for coupling is here, where you see railways and telegraphs. The growth of one helped the growth of the other, because as you were laying rail, you were also laying telegraph poles, and you were also having the same labor source. Same with oil and roads. As we were able to develop cheaper petroleum products and refined gasoline and petrol, then it co-evolved also with the demand for better roads. The demand for better roads and asphalt stimulated further supply and increases in consumption for oil and gasoline. And we're not very good at capturing these couplings and the co-evolutionary nature. And technologies can mimic each other. The example here is in the 1890s and 1900s, the internal combustion car mimicked or cannibalized or stole innovations from the electric car, including pneumatic tires, larger boot spaces, electrical motors, and batteries. All of that came from the EV. So they were incorporated into designs of the conventional car. So to say that the conventional car won and the EV died off isn't really true, because many elements of the EV lived on within the internal combustion car that Henry Ford went to make, the Model T, in the 1910s and 1920s. And lastly, there's a question of unit of analysis. At the level of Smill, where he talked about that global energy system, it looks very small. But if you zoom in to that oil transition that Smill said took 43 years, there were actually smaller changes in that system. Internal combustion engine growth was at more than 1,000%. The switch from steam engines and sailing ships was at 5,000%. The switch to oil lamps was at 10,000%. So some elements of the transition were happening very, very, very fast, even though global total primary supply looked like it was happening very slowly. And now we're going to switch to evidence that goes the other way. We looked at 10 extreme cases. These are not representative cases. We had to look for them. So they're extreme cases. Five of them in terms of energy end-use devices or prime movers, and five of them in terms of changes in security of supply. You can see as well, all of them have happened within our generation, right? The earliest one is the 40s. The most recent one is basically last decade. Look at how fast they grow. 1% for flex fuel vehicles in Brazil, or 1 year, 2 years for Kuwaiti crude oil and electricity, 3 years for Danish combined heat and power after the initial OPEC oil embargo. And if you look to the right, you can see the size of the populations affected. It's one thing to see the numbers. It's another to plot them like this. More than 900 million people have been affected by these 10 energy transitions in basically our lifetime, with major transitions happening in Indonesia for LPG stoves and China for improved cook stoves, as well as the French nuclear rollout, which really accelerated in the 70s and the 80s. So this idea that transitions can't happen fast, I think really does help refute Smill. Well, it depends on which transition and at which place and at which time. And then we did a follow-up study funded, thankfully, from ESRC and EPSRC to look at fast heat transitions. And these were transitions that weren't only rapid, they were fast, but also deep. And we found another 310 million people have been affected by transitions here, like solar. And look at the bottom case. British methane and natural gas from the North Sea, which replaced town gas, where Britain had area gas boards that converted 40 million appliances in people's homes in less than 10 years' time, so that they reached 92% of the UK population in about a decade and a half. Right. So this idea also that the UK can't have a steered, managed energy transition is also false. We did it already in the 60s and the 70s, just before most of us were actually born. I want to also flag some of the nice work from Florian and Carolyn, where they're kind of grappling with maybe the different drivers of energy transitions, that the kind of historical drivers that Smill talks about were either resource discoveries or wars. Like we either stumbled into a big resource we didn't think existed, like Middle Eastern oil or Alaskan oil, or we had major, major conflict, whether it is the world wars or the oil OPEC embargoes or Iraq, Kuwait. And they've said, well, while historically transitions kind of were by accident or were very reactive, today's transitions can actually be very proactive. What we did by chance before, we can now actively govern. And there's even a subfield of transition studies called strategic niche management, which is all about training people to manage new innovations, eco niches, so that they can succeed. Heat pumps and EVs, and perhaps organic solar photovoltaics and offshore wind. They also talk about how international innovation ecosystems can accelerate transitions in ways that are totally unexpected. And the example they give here is the German feed-in tariff for solar having cascading effects on Chinese manufacturing for solar photovoltaics and Malaysian manufacturing for thin-film solar PV. These actually hurt German industrial strategy, but they benefited globally because we had major economies of scale occur in ways that even the solar advocates didn't predict. It's why our projections of solar energy have been so off, because we never anticipated how fast these innovation dynamics would accelerate improvements in performance and reductions in cost. And lastly, Florian and Carolyn at least hoped that the Paris Agreement demonstrated a new global commitment towards net zero. And arguably that is, of course, fracturing right now somewhat with the United States, Russia, Saudi Arabia. But at least it was one of the first times like 190 countries stood together and argued that we have to actually implement our NDCs. Florian and Carolyn have also talked about building from Giels and Turnheim why not only do we need to focus on phase-in policies, but phase-out policies. And they here in this policy brief, which you can find online for free, talk about a whole variety of things that policymakers can do to stimulate getting rid of the old, changing market rules, having moratoriums, and so forth. One of which is just banning the technology. So you can ban coal. Like Denmark has had a moratorium on new coal-powered power plants for 40 years. Or you can ban cars. And Patrick, John, Simon, and Till here have a nice piece, I think it's Nature Sustainability, that talks about all of the cities and countries that have already announced bans on internal combustion cars worldwide, many of them huge: Beijing, Paris, Mexico City, London, and so forth. You can also see closer here in Europe, look at the Netherlands. The Hague is already banning fossil fuel related ads. And also look here at the number of kind of European Union target countries that are trying to ban gas boilers as of 2024, whether it is in all buildings or new buildings, or whether it's only oil boilers or gas boilers, and so forth. So again, I think we're starting to see a new phase of really using these phase out policies across coal, across gas boilers, across oil heating, and so forth. And this leads to this wonderful notion that you can also shape global energy transitions, not only with technology, but also with demand. These were projections that were made by Citibank, which I loved it. It was called Global Oil Demand Growth, the End is Nigh, that talked about how, if you look at the bottom left graph, oil will no longer grow. It'll hover around 90, I think, million barrels per day of production because of all those colors in blue, because of efficiency gains for cars, and then because of major substitution from shale gas. And you can also see these projections, which I think were accurate, about all the ways in which shale gas took off and actually substituted and eroded the growth of oil demand, at least in North America. All of these had to do with changing demand, not new supplies of oil. And I also want to take a moment. I had the benefit of flying to this wonderful IBM hosted event. They probably should have named it from junk, junk, but it was the Global Intelligent Utility Network Coalition. You can see a lot of big names here: Dong, which is now Ørsted, E.ON, TEPCO, the people who brought you Fukushima, KEPCO, Tata, CPFL, Centerpoint, and so forth. I think these are electricity utilities that also serve, hundreds of millions of people. And I was at a workshop where they talked about how the energy transition for them is not academic, it is reality. It is already happening as of 2015. And you can see all of the quote different transition threats that they've identified also across residential and commercial sectors. And it is a utility slide. We look at that second one. It is not solar PV adoption. It is PV grid defection. People are defecting from the grid. And it's fascinating that there was a utility that stood up. I can't tell you which one because of Chatham House rules. But this utility stood up and said for them, the future was not selling cubic meters of gas or kilowatt hours of electricity. They were looking into these markets to stay alive. They were looking at a radical pivot of business models. So maybe they'll start to sell batteries. Maybe they'll start to do peak shaving. Maybe they'll sell better automated software. Oh, look at this. Maybe they'll become a bank and will just do bonds and third-party financing. That is how radical these electric utilities are thinking when faced with the reality of multiple energy transitions. And one of the other presenters presented this in 2015, where they talked about the kind of 67 different apps or startups that were making homes smarter and more digitalized. Many of them relate to energy. Look at lighting and energy and utilities and device controllers. We actually were inspired. We were a part of CREDS with Nick Eyre, the Center for Research and Energy Demand Solutions, funded by UKRI, leading a work package on digitalization and digital society. And we wanted to replicate this study, which was from the US. So we did. My wonderful research fellow did 30 interviews and visited 37 retail shops all around Brighton, London, Bristol, and Manchester. And one of the questions we asked was, how many smart home technologies are available? It went from 67 in the US to 267 here in Europe. And notice the number of Fortune 500 companies that are involved in supplying these products: Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Nike, Apple, and so forth. Also look at how many deal with energy: appliances, lighting, gas and utilities, integrated solutions like Nest or Hive. And I put this here because many of us who are old enough, in the early 90s, there was no World Wide Web. There was no internet. So if you would have told us just 30 years ago, oh, in 2025, 2026, there'd be this thing called the internet, and you would have a mobile phone that would have this thing called an app where you could connect to digital devices, we wouldn't have known. So it is such a dramatic shift in how we can actually consume and visualize energy in the home that most people wouldn't have even imagined um, a few decades ago. Right. Before I close, and I do want to stop soon to open it up for questions, I do want to come back to this notion of interdisciplinarity. And already it isn't just interdisciplinarity in terms of the concepts. I also want to talk about why decarbonization or net zero transitions are an interdisciplinary challenge for four reasons. And one of them I haven't talked a lot about. It was hidden in the Chinese case study for cook stoves and the Indonesian case for LPG stoves. And that is, one of the most dangerous things a woman can still do today is cook, because there is a massive amount of indoor air pollution. 4 million deaths a year from indoor air pollution attributed mostly to cook stove smoke. 80% of that is women and children under the age of 5. So if we really want to shape that transition, the World Health Organization has this wonderful diagram that we have to have the pollution scientists who are working on combustion and fuel design and chemistry and physics work with those who actually change the living environment. That's architects, that's maybe qualitative engineers, responsible innovation design, who then work with people who talk about behavior, psychology, practices, fuel preparation, food drying, and waste, as well as changing where you actually put children when you cook. And I love this diagram because it implies the solution relies on interdisciplinarity across the fuel sciences, the built environment sciences, and the behavioral sciences. Second example, this is my colleague's simplified diagram of why households consume energy. Part of it is related to attitudes, part is related to routines, part is related to capabilities, and part is related to external conditions like policies or the specifics to different energy devices. And I think, again, if you're going to actually fully understand the full array by which people's lifestyles intersect, you have to have sociologists working with psychologists, working with demographers, working with economists, working with political scientists, and energy studies scholars. Third example. My colleague Felix Kreutzig has talked about the way that we could accelerate climate mitigation. He has this wonderful framework called Avoid, Shift, Improve, and how we have to actually apply it not just to energy. We have to apply it to transportation, to buildings, to food, and consumption of other products, clothing, appliances, textiles, which means to create a policy mix for decarbonization. The transport scholars must work with the building scholars, must work with the industrial scholars, must work with the fashion scholars, must work with the food scholars. Again, interdisciplinarity is built into how that entire approach would work. And lastly, I mentioned the multi-level perspective on innovation. This is from Frank Hills and others. We had this nice piece published in Science that talks about how these energy transitions are multi-scalar, are polycentric, involving different actors, government, civil society, households, industry associations, and also temporally dynamic, where they create these windows of opportunity as transitions go from emergence to acceleration to stabilization. And again, to understand the multi-level perspective, you have to have scholars who understand business models, who understand behavior, who understand culture, who understand users, who understand innovation, who understand broader political trends, broader economic trends, and broader demographic trends. Again, it demands interdisciplinarity. And in a very recent article published last year, I teamed up with Frank Giels and Johann Schott and others to really grapple with accelerating transitions. We identified no less than 8 different challenges. And again, look at the diversity of these challenges: consumption, social practices, governance, justice, which again demand interdisciplinary collaborations. And we also identified 5 key drivers of acceleration that all have different underlying causal mechanisms, from economics to businesses and firms to policy feedbacks to discursive framing struggles in the media and narratives. All of it matters for transitions, and this makes transitions a very big tent that demands perhaps every discipline. We also try to map these different approaches on different areas of scholarship, whether they focus on individuals or institutions and collective groups, and whether they really kind of focus on rational choice theories, on conflict theories, on structural theories, and interpretivist theories. And what's really neat is you can see all of these circles cut across the different dimensions. So it kind of is showing that these new heuristics and concepts like tipping points or leverage points or feedback loops are intentionally stitching together very diverse perspectives that bring in politics and business and economics. So new relational theories that are very holistic and socio-technical. Lastly, the last thing we did in this article is we did talk about kind of a typology of what accelerating a transition is. Is it an outcome that has different conditions? Is it a process to be stimulated, or is it a normative ambition to be achieved, right? And I think it actually is all of them, depending on which approach you take. And you can also visualize these very different views of what a transition is, as a process, as a phase, as a normative ambition, or maybe even as a multi-system phenomenon. Each of them have very different implications and underlying dynamics and policy recommendations. So to conclude, to go back to Aristotle, and also to go back to these arbitrary numbers from Smil and Grubler, whether a transition is fast or slow will depend on how it is defined, what its unit of analysis is, what its thresholds are, what its coupling is, and so forth. So always check the sources whenever you see a study that proclaims a transition is fast or slow. We have no shortage of conceptual tools. We identified 96. Maybe this implies they're all rubbish. Maybe it implies we have yet to create a unifying theory of transitions. We have no Darwin, we have no theory of evolution that can unify the different approaches yet. Or maybe this is something to be celebrated. If there are 96 ways to interpret a film, or 96 ways to react to a piece of art, or 96 ways to enjoy a cuisine, then maybe that's how it should be. Maybe there should be 96 different ways or more of viewing a transition. My own take is that all of them are useful, but none of them are complete. So it will depend on your research question, your context, your case study, your methods, and so forth. So they're all potentially interesting, but they all are self-limiting. That said, you can also take from our work the multi-level perspective and social practice theory are currently the most favored in the community. I could also see this finding going 2 ways. On the one hand, I could see scholars saying we'll use them because people know what they are. There's a vernacular. Peer reviewers will understand. It's kind of accepted. Or I can see many scholars saying, well, I won't use them because I don't want to use what everyone else is using, and I'll try to use maybe theories that aren't so popular. Even though we have all of those different frameworks, I still think that multidisciplinary approaches are essential. And think back to those 4 areas I mentioned, right? We will not solve the issue of cook stoves and gender unless we have that interdisciplinary approach across combustion sciences, the built environment, and behavior. We won't understand people's lifestyle choices unless we really understand norms and routines and habits and prices and technology. We won't understand policy mixes unless we can actually understand transport and buildings and food and consumption. And we won't understand multi-level dynamics unless we understand culture and industry and demographics and political changes and so forth. And also, I didn't say this until now, there's also a great need for cases that aren't just weird. And what do I mean by that? Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. This is about 15 years old, article in Nature, that some of these weird countries like the UK and the US had 12% of the global population, but 96% of publications. And we have done work as well that finds this weird bias still very much exists with net zero. Maybe it has more studies on China, but for the rest of the non-weird countries, we're really lacking cases around the world. And by the way, here is the article that you can see in 2010 from Nature. The causes are complex behind these transitions, whether it's war or famine or oil crises. Only one of those fast 10 transitions we identified was based on demand, which was air conditioning, and that's arguably in the wrong direction from a sustainability standpoint. Future transitions, however, might be different. They might be driven by all those phase outs I mentioned, phase out of boilers, phase out of ads, phase out of conventional cars, phase out of fossil fuels. They might be driven by scarcity or demand pressures like shale gas, right, including pandemics or wars, think Ukraine, Russia, rather than traditional ones on supply or markets or abundance. And I think my retort to Smill, Grubler, and Wilson is the past is definitely instructive, but when it comes to where we are with transitions, it is no longer predictive. And with that, thank you for your time.
Well, I hope you can hear us in Seoul, South Korea, Ben. That was a fantastic, informative talk. Can we give Benjamin a Cities at Tufts round of applause, please?